How prepared is the UK for a major cyber attack? Good afternoon, this is Business Live with me, Ian King. The Bank of England's economic forecasting has deteriorated significantly. Its economic model has significant shortcomings and its software is seriously out of date. Those are among the findings of Ben Bernanke, the former chairman of the US Federal Reserve, who was asked by the bank to carry out a review of its forecasting. The review was launched after the bank was criticised for underestimating the surge in inflation following the end of the pandemic. Well, Dr. Bernanke's recommendations include scrapping the so-called fan charts that the bank has produced for more than a decade to illustrate possible outcomes for growth and inflation. Well, joining me now is Michael Saunders, former member of the bank's Monetary Policy Committee. Michael, very good to see you this afternoon. Dr. Bernanke's conclusions are pretty damning, don't you think?
The forecasting record of all the central banks hasn't been great in the last few years, really because the economies have been hit by major shocks from energy prices, food prices, the pandemic. And actually, the Bank of England's forecast record over that period is really no better or worse than other major central banks. But look, I think this review is a very useful and sensible exercise. It proposes a lot of useful changes which should help to make the Bank of England's forecasts and communications better than they have been. I commend this report. I think it's a very thorough and detailed piece of work.
Obviously, he thinks that the fan charts have had their day, something that those of us who've covered the inflation reports over the years are very used to. Is he right to make that conclusion?
Yes, I think so. Look, the issue here is how do you deal with uncertainty around the central forecast? The way in which the Bank of England has done it previously is to use fan charts of gradually diminishing depth of colour and increasing width. So by the end of the forecast period, 2 or 3 years ahead, the fan charts cover a very wide range of outcomes and say, well, really, sort of anything is possible. Now, that's not terribly useful as a guide to the major uncertainties. The change which Dr. Bernanke is proposing is to make more use of scenarios. The MPC has long identified what it thinks are the major risks around their central forecast. Bernanke's review says, well, OK, let's see what those risks would look like if they were to materialize. You could think of the current situation, for example. There's an upside risk to inflation if pay growth were to be stronger for longer. So let's see how that risk would look and what the interest rate response might be. And there's probably a downside risk to growth, for example, which might cause inflation to fall faster and interest rates to fall faster. So turning those from just a text description of risks into scenarios, I think that would help people to understand how the major risks to the outlook might affect things if they were to play out.
Now, Ben Bernanke is very clear that he wants the software at the bank modernised fairly rapidly. Given what you know of the bank, your own experiences, how likely is that to happen?
Oh, I think it will happen. The bank has accepted the proposals from these changes. They can't all be done straight away. It'll take time to work them through. But this will lead to a fairly major overhaul of the way in which the bank's forecasting machinery takes place. I should add, I think these reviews should be done just as a matter of course. This is something which you should do every 5, 6, 8 years or so. The Central Bank of New Zealand, for example, does an expert-led external review every 5 years, looking into its forecasts, its communications, and its policy decisions. And that generates a lot of useful proposals, which the central bank then incorporates. But many businesses do this kind of learning from experience just as an integral part of how they operate. The central bank is quite reasonable for them to do the same thing.
Yeah, I mean, it's interesting you say that. I mean, the scenarios in particular that the bank is being encouraged to produce now, the irony is that the bank's regulatory arm, the FPC, has been asking the commercial banks to do just that for quite a while now.
Yes, that's right. So the Bank of England has long stress-tested the financial system, banks and insurance companies, to ensure that they are robust enough, resilient enough to cope with major risks. And you can think of how that might work in forecasting the economy as well. For example, let's run the clock back to early 1992 when Russia's just invading Ukraine. Energy prices had gone up but not as much as they subsequently rose. But you can imagine at that point, the MPC might have had a scenario around their central forecast for a much greater and more persistent rise in energy prices. And it would have been useful to have that worked through in order to illustrate and to prepare people for what might happen if such an outcome were to materialize, which of course it subsequently did.
OK, Michael, we have to leave it there. It's been quite a while since we had you on the programme. It's lovely to see you again. Thank you. Now, the UK is almost certainly out of the shallow recession it ended last year. Office for National Statistics said this morning that the economy grew by 0.1% in February. That followed the growth it notched up in January, which the ONS this morning revised up from 0.2% to 0.3%. The ONS said that during the 3 months to the end of February, the economy grew by 0.2%. With growth also expected in March, it means that the economy has almost certainly emerged from technical recession. That's defined, of course, as 2 consecutive quarters of negative growth. Production, in particular manufacturing, was the main driver of growth in February. That experienced an expansion of 1.1% during the month, while the services sector grew by 0.1%. Some other business news stories for you now. And the state-owned oil company of Abu Dhabi has reportedly looked at BP as a possible takeover target. Reuters says that Abu Dhabi national oil company ADNOC had spoken directly to BP in recent months and also sought advice from investment banks on a potential deal. But it says deliberations did not get further than preliminary discussions after ADNOC concluded BP was not the right fit for its strategy. Well, separately, Sky City editor Mark Kleiman is reporting that Bernard Looney, BP's former chief executive, has held talks with ADNOC about a senior advisor role. The Financial Conduct Authority said today it had written to providers of motor finance to remind them they must maintain adequate financial resources at all times. The FCA said lenders would need to ensure they were adequately prepared to meet costs of consumer complaints related to commission agreements on car loans. Well, the warning comes as the regulator carries out a review of discretionary commission agreements on car loans, a practice banned in 2021, but which before then allowed motor dealers to set their own interest rate on repayment plans. The FCA said today that firms involved in its review had engaged with it constructively, but had added that many firms were struggling to promptly provide the data it needed. JP Morgan has warned that its net interest income, the spread between what it charges borrowers and pays depositors, is likely to be little different this year from last year. America's biggest bank said this was because customers had been moving their money from zero to low interest checking accounts to high yielding savings products. Well, the news sent shares of JP Morgan down 4.5%, and that was despite news that profits for the first 3 months of the year came in at $13.42 billion, which was up 6% on the same period last year. Now, trade unions are the latest organisations to report falling victim to cyber attacks, with the Communication Workers Union and the Train Drivers Union ASLEF saying it appears hackers have tried to obtain members' data. Well, just last month, the Joint Committee on National Security Strategy warned that the UK is ill-prepared for a nationwide ransomware attack. I've been speaking with Andrew Rubin, he's Chief Executive of the cybersecurity company Illumio, about where he thinks the weaknesses are.
I think in general, most critical infrastructure, and this is not a UK comment, I think it's a global comment, I think most critical infrastructure is underprotected, and there's a very serious concern around resilience right now.
How have we got into that position?
I think it's probably a combination of a few things. There's not a single root cause. One is these systems are very old, and that's, again, a global comment, not just in the UK. There's a lot of legacy sitting out there running some of the most critical services that we all rely on as citizens. I think the second thing is that cyber's been so focused for so long on assuming that we can keep a bad threat out that we haven't really asked the question, which now is being asked more and more often by governments and regulators around the world, which is, we live in a world where breaches and ransomware are now part of our lives, unfortunately. What are we doing to be more resilient against this new threat?
But it's your assumption now that eventually a bad actor is going to get through increasingly?
I think it should be every regulator, government, board assumption going forward.
Which are the particular sectors most vulnerable, do you think?
You know, you hear certain sectors talked about, so obviously financial services because of the criticality of the infrastructure. We talk about things like the electric grid, the healthcare systems, and all of the IT and all of the technology that supports the delivery of services. So I think when you think about it from the perspective of what are the critical services we rely on, it becomes very obvious what the answer to that question is.
Has the nature of the bad actors changed, particularly over the... I mean, we used to talk about it being state bad actors, then more recently it was individuals. What's the nature of the threat just now? Where are they coming from?
So I think we're in a very interesting moment in time, and I actually believe that it's the first time that we find ourselves here in terms of the threat landscape. You're having the convergence of two things at the same time. There is an enormous amount of ransomware, and it's growing very quickly, which is really financial crime. It's the modern version of robbing the bank. It is truly today's version of financial crime. But we also have a geopolitical landscape, and obviously, unfortunately, we're seeing that in multiple regions in the world. So you have the nation state, you have the criminal who's after financial gain, and you've got both of these things swelling up together. And it goes without saying that either one of these threats in of itself is serious. But when we have both of these things growing at the same time, it presents a very different set of challenges.
Has there been an increase in incidents of attacks from Russia since they attacked Ukraine?
I think we've seen, because of the geopolitical landscape in all of the different issues that we see around the world right now, we've seen more nation-state activity, and we've seen, obviously, some of the motions in the past, but with a lot more, I'll say, size and scale. So, for instance, we know that elections have obviously been a target from a nation-state perspective. We have a big one coming up in the United States later this year. We know that these are events that nation-states tend to try and use as a way to attack each other. And I think that we're living again in this moment of time where everything seems to be swelling at the same time.
So you would expect there to be concerted efforts made on the part of other states to disrupt the US elections this year?
I think it's fair to say that right now we should assume breach in everything. We should assume attack in everything. Whether or not it occurs every time is not the game or the guesswork that we're trying to do. I think what we have to assume is that this is now part of the landscape, and our job is to try and do two very simple things that unfortunately are very difficult to do. One, prevent as much of it as possible, and equally accept that we're going to miss. These problems are going to occur, and resiliency, our ability to protect our most critical infrastructure, and our ability to pick ourselves back up when we do miss as quickly as possible. This is now the job that we have going forward, and they're of equal importance.
Now, your business has just marked its 10th anniversary. Is it where you would have expected it to have been a decade ago?
It's such a great question, because it implies that 10 years ago I sat down, or the early team sat down and thought about it. You know, the reality is that in so many ways we've accomplished things that I never imagined us accomplishing in any period of time. I look at the products that we deliver for our customers. I look at some of the critical infrastructure that Illumio is helping to protect today. I never even thought about that as part of the script. But at the same time, and I think most founders and CEOs believe this, I feel like we're in the very early stages of building the company. So despite 10 years and a business that now has a global footprint, I feel like we're just getting going.
That was Andrew Rubin from Illumio. Well, still to come here on Business Live. We'll have a look at how the markets have finished this day. It's been quite a week. Have more for you in just a few moments. Don't go away.
Especially when I was younger, like during the lockdown, I read a lot, but the only problem was I didn't really see lots of books that had people who looked like me in it. So one of my inspirations is that I wanted to put my own face into my own book. And then also another thing is most of my books, it's like I got inspiration through my past experiences, and that is and also my family values, and that is what really inspired me to write these books.
Here's Amma. I can see the likeness here, Sarah. Very good. Talk to me about the stories, the adventures you wanted to write about.
So, with this book, it was mainly inspired by my trip to Ghana last year. So most of the things, for example, in one of the pages over here, it shows her feeding and doing her chores out in the garden, feeding the chickens and the goats, and that's something that I did.
This is the school you went to visit in Ghana, is it?
Yes, that's the school I went to visit, and that is the library that I am refurbishing.
We have family values where we normally, Christmas time, we do packages and give to charities around, like homeless people around. And we saw that joy that brought to her. So when she wrote the book and showed it to me, and she actually came back and said, I wanted to donate the money to charity, I was surprised, but wasn't too surprised.
Emirates Premium Economy. Maybe one day all airlines will have seats like this. Fly Emirates, fly better.
Welcome back. Time now for a look at the markets. And we're going to start with the oil price, which has rallied sharply this afternoon to hit its highest level since the 23rd of October last year, amid mounting tensions in the Middle East. A barrel of Brent crude will currently set you back $91.04 a barrel. That's up nearly 1.5% so far today. It means that, contrary to expectations earlier on in the day, the oil price should finish the week higher. On the foreign exchange markets, well, the pound has sold off sharply again today against the US dollar as the latter continues to trade higher following the US inflation data earlier this week. This has been the dollar's best week, actually, since 2022 against both sterling and the euro. The pound currently off 0.75% against the greenback. That's its lowest level since November. The euro also off by a similar amount against the dollar. On the equity markets, this is how it's finished in Europe this afternoon. Pretty mixed picture right now. Germany, the standout there, I guess, off 0.25%. Interesting to note, big talking point in Germany today, the German battery maker Varta has fallen by some 30%. That's on news it does not expect to be profitable until 2026. Well, here in London, we thought for a while that the FTSE 100 might hit an all-time closing high today. It's traded this afternoon within 3 points of its all-time intraday high. Support, of course, coming from all those heavyweight dollar earners. Here's how it's finished. The FTSE up 0.9%, just shy of 8,000. BP and Shell alone added nearly 30 points to the index on that higher oil price. BP, of course, that takeover talk as well there, up nearly 3.75% on the session. Among other gainers in the Premier Index today was Taylor Wimpey. That's on optimism that the housing market is starting to revive. Outside the FTSE 100, the commercial property group Great Portland Estates is ahead by 1.5%. It received a push this morning from one of the brokers. Over on Wall Street, well, all of the major indices opened to the downside. You can see the Nasdaq off 1% right now. It hit a record high yesterday, of course. The banks are weighing on the indices, well, certainly the S&P 500. Reports from JP Morgan and Citi, which are currently off 4.5% and 0.75% respectively. Wells Fargo bucked the trend. They also had an update out today, and their shares are slightly higher just now. Show you the gold price again. Talked about that a fair bit lately. That's hit another all-time high today as geopolitical tension continues to support the yellow metal, an ounce of gold will currently set you back $2,391.38 an ounce. That's up 0.75%. Well, joining me this afternoon is Bill Dinning, Chief Investment Officer at Waverton. Bill, great to see you as ever. What a week it's been. I mean, I guess the sort of showstopper was the inflation data. It's really pepped up the dollar no end.
Yes, those rate expectations on the back of that, which had already been shifting materially. So at the end of the last year, the market was thinking the Federal Reserve might cut 6 times, the Bank of England might cut 5 times. Well, both of them are now likely to cut maybe twice between now and early next year. And I think, you know, that's obviously had a material impact on the dollar. Sterling hasn't moved against the euro, so it's a dollar phenomenon, as you said, I think.
Yeah.
So it's geopolitical risk boosts dollar, and as you said, the inflation number was disappointing.
But you've got quite an interesting theory on the timing of when the Fed starts to cut now.
Well, I think it's very interesting to me that the market's pricing in, there's fully priced in a cut by the Fed in September. Well, that is going to be something like 6 weeks before the November presidential election. And the last time that the Federal Reserve cut interest rates in an election year was 2008, in the middle of the financial crisis. But they've not done it prior to that since 1992. And 1992, central banking was a bit different then. In 94, when the Fed raised interest rates in early 94, they surprised the market. That was very, very bad for the bond market. It probably led in its own way to the devaluation of the Mexican peso, rather strangely.
Well.
So the Fed learned from that to communicate, to flag when it was going to make changes. To be cutting rates 6 weeks before the election, I think that's very unlikely. So I suspect that something could go wrong, in which case they might have to respond. But if it doesn't, then I wouldn't be surprised if that first rate cut got pushed past the election.
That's really quite a call, Bill. I mean, on that basis, would you expect to see further dollar strength?
On the potentially, yes, although obviously it depends a little bit. So the expectations for rate cuts in Europe from the ECB and the Bank of England, if anything, they could be, the market is probably right to think that the euro area might go even if the Fed doesn't. But the UK is another interesting one. You know, the UK was pricing in a September rate cut, but if there's an October election, that might be tricky. So we might end up with these rate cuts coming, you know, at the tail end of the fourth quarter.
Just to go back to what you were saying about inflation in the US just now, I mean, we've obviously seen Treasury yields rising, 10 years back above 4% now. I mean, I was talking to my colleague Will Frost this morning. He said, look out for 5% on the 10-year. Is that plausible, do you think?
Well, you could get there. I mean, we were there a few months ago. The only question, I think the thing about that is whether or not, if the market's just postponing when they think the Fed's going to be cutting, yes, there's been a repricing of that, but whether or not we get a sort of full reprice back to 5%, I'm not sure. Some of that will also depend on the inflation data. But the market definitely is getting more concerned about inflation. So the price of things like inflation swaps that are directly related to what the market's expecting future inflation to be, you know, they have moved up. So whether over short time periods like 2 or 5 years or over longer time periods, they have moved up. And if that continues to be the case, then you're right. Maybe we will push up towards 5. We think there's probably a bit of value there. And I think if you look at some parts of the Treasury market, look at the inflation-linked part of the Treasury market, the 10-year benchmark inflation-linked bond in the States has got a real yield of about 2.1%. I mean, that's probably quite attractive.
Now, looking here at the UK, I mentioned the BP takeover speculation earlier. I mean, it is clear that both BP and Shell CEOs regard their stock price as being pretty undervalued, Shell in particular.
Yes, as indeed is the whole of the UK market. Yeah, I mean, it's a shame it didn't hit an all-time high today because it wouldn't have made any difference to the relative chart. You know, lots of markets, I mean, you mentioned Nasdaq hit an all-time high yesterday, but that was its multiple all-time high in recent months. So, yeah, I think the UK PLC and indeed the London Stock Exchange has got an issue. And I think, you know, there are 1 or 2 self-help things they could do. You know, some journalists are sort of suggesting that we should get rid of things like stamp duty on share deal. That might work. The government's brought in this UK-focused ISA. I'm not sure that's going to be of the sort of quantum. But, yeah, you can understand why UK-based CEOs of big global companies can see there's a bit of a UK discount, but it's a difficult that's a difficult one. I would hope that that doesn't happen. What we could really do with is more tech and communication services companies. They're 4% of the market.
Yeah, need more of them coming to the market.
That's been the issue for UK underperformance. After all, on a day like this, you want to own Shell and BP.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, very briefly, do you still see more takeovers happening in the UK? I mean, this week alone, we've had Gresham Technologies and Lock and Store being taken out.
Well, I think that's imminently possible because there's not a valuation problem in the UK. The UK market's trading at something like a 35% discount to the world index, which is high even by its own standards. And there have been a lot of UK-listed babies thrown out with the bathwater. There's a lot of value in the UK market.
OK, Bill, got to leave it there. Good to see you as ever. Thank you. That's it for me for this week. I'll be back on Monday at 11:30. Hope very much to see you then. In the meantime, do stay tuned. Coming up next, it's the News Hour with Simon Mosin. Thanks for joining me today. Have a good weekend. Cheerio.
It's 5 o'clock. I'm Simon Mawson. This is the News Hour, 60 minutes of news, analysis and interviews. We begin right now with the top stories this hour. Hands in the till, the former post office boss who blamed shortfalls in the Horizon system on sub-postmasters. Jerusalem on alert as foreign ministries warn against travel to Israel amid fears of an Iran attack in the coming days. Meanwhile, the first aid trucks enter Gaza's northern border. 4 men are jailed for a total of 73 years for a drive-by shooting at a funeral which left a 7-year-old fighting for her life. Greater Manchester Police reopen an investigation into Labour's deputy leader Angela Rayner over the sale of her council house. And good going, why organisers of tomorrow's Grand National are placing their bets on a trouble-free race.